Have you ever noticed how the most painful choices often arrive disguised as relief? How the very thing you know will cost you everything somehow feels like the only option in the moment? You stand at the edge of a decision, heart racing, logic whispering warnings, and still you reach for what burns. And afterward, when the damage is done, when the silence settles in your chest, you ask yourself the same quiet question again and again. Why do I keep doing this to myself? You tell yourself you're smart enough to know better. You've read the books. You've promised change. You've sworn this time would be different. And yet the pattern returns with the precision of a tide. A relationship you knew would break you. A habit you knew would hollow you out. A risk you knew would cost more than it gives. It doesn't feel like stupidity. It feels like gravity, as if something inside you pulls toward the wound before you even realize you're moving. Think of the child who learned early that love came with conditions, that safety was unpredictable, that wanting too much only led to disappointment. That child grows older, sharper, more capable, but the nervous system still remembers the old rules. The body still reacts before the mind has time to argue. Neuroscience tells us that under emotional pressure, the brain doesn't consult wisdom, it consults memory. The amygdala fires before the rational cortex can intervene, choosing familiarity over safety, intensity over stability. Even pain can feel like home if you learned it there. Then there is the adult version of you, standing in the middle of a failing relationship, watching yourself stay long after hope has expired. You call it patience, you call it loyalty, but underneath, something quieter is happening, an anxious attachment reaching for validation, a fear of abandonment whispering that empty connection is better than no connection at all. The mask you wear tells the world you are strong. The shadow beneath it is terrified of being alone. You don't sabotage because you enjoy suffering. You sabotage because suffering feels recognizable. There is a strange comfort in choosing the same fire you've survived before, rather than stepping into an unfamiliar kind of light. Psychologists call this repetition compulsion, the unconscious urge to replay unresolved emotional wounds, hoping this time the ending will change. But the monster within doesn't want a new ending. It wants confirmation of the story it already believes about you. And so you keep choosing what hurts, not because you are broken, but because your nervous system is loyal to a past that taught you how to survive, not how to flourish. Every bad decision is not a failure of intelligence. It is an echo of an older strategy that once kept you alive. But strategies built for survival rarely build happiness. And the question that lingers is not why you fall back into these choices, but when and how they were first written into you at all. Do you remember the first time you chose silence instead of truth, compliance instead of desire, survival instead of safety? You were small then, too young to call it a decision, but your nervous system made it anyway. Maybe it was the night you learned that asking for comfort brought irritation instead of warmth. Or the moment you realize that being easy to manage earned more love than being honest. A child doesn't analyze these moments. A child absorbs them. And somewhere deep inside you, a rule was quietly written. Some needs are dangerous, some feelings are too expensive, and some choices are safer when they hurt less on the surface. In one version of the story, you learned to become invisible. You watched adults argue, watched moods shift without warning, and you discovered that disappearing emotionally made the storm pass faster. So you folded yourself inward. You grew quiet. You became good at not needing. Emotional shutdown became your shelter, and later, your loneliness. In another version, you learned to perform. You noticed that praise arrived when you pleased, when you adapted, when you became what others needed. So you learned to shapeshift. You made a garden without water and called it selflessness, not realizing that one day you would stand inside it, thirsty, wondering why nothing inside you felt alive. Attachment theory tells us that your earliest bonds became the blueprint for how you would later choose love, risk, and belonging. If care was unpredictable, your nervous system learned to chase. If affection was conditional, your worth became a transaction. If boundaries were controlling, your rebellion became your only language of freedom. Neuroscience reminds us that before your rational brain was fully built, your emotional brain was already recording. The amygdala kept the receipts. The body learned before the mind ever had words. You didn't choose chaos because you liked it. You chose it because it felt familiar. You didn't choose neglect because you preferred emptiness. You chose it because emptiness was predictable. Even pain can feel safer than uncertainty when it is the only temperature you've ever known. So you grew up carrying a mask shaped like strength, hiding a shadow shaped like fear. The monster within you was not born cruel, it was born defensive. Now you move through adulthood with adult responsibilities, but childhood wiring. You call your impulses personality. You call your avoidance independence. You call your self-sacrifice love. Yet beneath every choice that later undoes you, there is still that child, reaching for the same strategies that once kept the world from collapsing. And this is the quiet truth that changes everything. You were never choosing wrong. You were choosing what once kept you alive, but survival and fulfillment are not the same language. And the moment you recognize that difference, the next chapter of your story, your adult mask, begins to take shape. Have you ever wondered why the choices that feel most you later feel like the very things that undo you? You tell yourself you are finally free now, that no one controls you, that you answer only to your own will, and yet your life begins to mirror the same emotional weather again and again. Different faces, different cities, different circumstances, but the same storms. You call it fate, but deep inside, something older is still making the decisions. You move through the world wearing a polished mask called personality. Perhaps it looks like impulsiveness, the thrill of acting without thinking, as if speed itself could outrun the ache that follows you. Perhaps it looks like emotional distance, a careful coolness that keeps love just far enough away that it cannot wound you too deeply. Or perhaps it looks like reckless devotion, falling hard and fast into relationships that burn bright and die young, confusing intensity with intimacy because stillness feels like abandonment. Each behavior feels like choice. Each one feels like freedom. But beneath the surface, the shadow is still steering. Imagine the adult who stays in a relationship that keeps draining them, long after the hurt becomes routine. You say you are loyal. You say you are patient. But late at night, when the house is quiet, the child inside you is still waiting to be chosen, still hoping that endurance will finally earn the safety it never received. Or think of the one who destroys every chance at stability with one impulsive decision after another, spending what they don't have, quitting what they worked for, chasing chaos as if boredom were a threat more terrifying than failure. The monster within is not chasing destruction, it is chasing feeling, because numbness once meant danger. Even your ambition can carry the fingerprints of your past. You push, grind, exhaust yourself chasing a version of success that never fully satisfies. You tell yourself you are driven. What you rarely admit is how afraid you are of stillness, how silence feels like that old room where needs went unanswered. So you keep running, you keep proving, you keep postponing rest like a luxury you have not earned. Attachment patterns quietly shape all of this. Anxious hearts overinvest, avoidant hearts disappear. Trauma teaches the nervous system that safety is temporary and that control is survival. So your adult life becomes a reenactment in different costumes. The mask changes, the shadow does not, and every time a choice costs you more than it gives, a quiet resentment grows. You resent others for the pain you helped repeat. You resent yourself for lacking the strength to stop. Loneliness deepens because even when surrounded, you feel unseen, hidden behind the very mask you built to be accepted. You believe you are choosing freely, but the truth is more unsettling. Many of your choices are echoes, and as long as the echoes feel like your own voice, you will keep mistaking memory for will. Yet beneath all this lies an even deeper force, one that doesn't live in story or emotion at all, but in nerve, chemical, and firing pattern, waiting to reveal that your struggle is not only psychological, but biological too. Have you ever felt yourself reaching for the wrong choice, even while a quieter voice inside you begged you to stop? You watch your hand move toward the flame as if it belongs to someone else, and afterward you wonder how you could have betrayed your own knowing so easily. This is the moment where emotion outruns reason, where your body decides before your mind is allowed to speak. Neuroscience tells us something unsettling here. Your brain was built for survival, not for wisdom, and in moments of stress, it will always choose what feels good now over what will save you later. Dopamine floods your system with promise. It doesn't care about consequences. It only cares about relief, escape, and reward. The brain treats craving like oxygen, and under pressure, you don't analyze, you gasp. That is why the impulsive text gets sent, the destructive habit resurfaces, the risky decision feels irresistible. Your rational cortex, the part of you that understands time, damage, and consequence, is slower than the part of you that learned to run. When fear or desire spikes, control is chemically overridden. The monster within doesn't whisper. It surges. Trauma rewires this process even further. Studies show that chronic stress reshapes the brain's perception of danger and safety. Threat becomes exaggerated. Calm becomes suspicious. You begin to misread peace as boredom and chaos as aliveness. Your nervous system confuses intensity with connection, urgency with meaning. Emotional regulation becomes harder because the brain learned long ago that staying on high alert was the only way to survive. Even when the danger is gone, the body keeps scanning the horizon. Think of the adult who explodes over something small, not because the moment is large, but because stored emotion finally finds a crack to escape, or the one who cannot delay gratification, not because they lack discipline, but because their brain learned early that tomorrow is unreliable. Cognitive bias deepens the trap. Confirmation bias makes you collect evidence that supports your worst beliefs about yourself. Negativity bias makes failure feel heavier than success, and the repetition compulsion keeps replaying the same emotional script with different actors, hoping for a different ending. You begin to realize something both terrifying and relieving. Many of your self-sabotaging choices are not moral failures. They are neurological patterns carved by experience, reinforced by chemistry, and protected by the brain's obsession with the familiar. You wear the mask of free will, but beneath it your shadow moves through neural circuits older than your conscious identity. The garden inside you struggles to grow, not because you lack seeds, but because your soil learned drought before it learned rain. And yet awareness changes the story in a fragile way. Understanding the wiring does not instantly dismantle it. Knowing the trap does not automatically free you from it. Sometimes it only sharpens the pain of watching yourself fall again, fully conscious, fully wounded, which leads to the darkest truth of all, that insight alone cannot save you from the patterns that shaped you. It only shows you just how deep they run and invites you toward the shadow where identity itself begins to dissolve. Have you ever caught yourself speaking your failures like a name, wearing your worst patterns as if they were proof of who you are? Somewhere along the way, the story quietly shifts. You stop saying, "I made a bad decision," and you begin to say, "This is just who I am." Reckless, unlucky, broken, a person who ruins things. And once that story hardens, every new mistake feels less like an accident and more like destiny being fulfilled. The shadow does not arrive as violence or chaos at first. It arrives as familiarity. It sounds like the voice that shrugs when things fall apart. The voice that says you should have known better, but somehow always expected this ending. Shame becomes a kind of compass that always points back to the same terrain. Psychologically, shame doesn't correct behavior, it cements it. Studies show that when identity fuses with failure, the brain stops seeking change and starts seeking confirmation. You unconsciously choose situations that will prove the story true, because false hope feels more dangerous than predictable disappointment. You see it in the adult who stays loyal to pain as if it were a promise. They remain in relationships that diminish them, not because they believe things will improve, but because suffering feels like home. Punishment becomes comfort. Loneliness becomes familiar architecture. And every small kindness feels suspicious, like a foreign language the nervous system no longer trusts. The shadow whispers that you don't deserve better, that wanting more is arrogance, that safety is for other people. Even success can feel threatening here. When good things arrive, the nervous system tenses, waiting for the inevitable collapse. So you sabotage preemptively. You pick a fight, you miss the opportunity, you relapse into the habit. The monster within is not trying to destroy you. It is trying to protect the identity it knows how to survive as. The mask you wear to the world says, "I don't care." The shadow beneath it is terrified of being proven wrong about your worth. Think of the child who once learned that love was unstable. That child grows into an adult who confuses chaos with belonging. Attachment wounds echo forward, teaching the nervous system that calm is dangerous, that stability is temporary, that loss is inevitable. So you grip the poison with steady hands, not because you enjoy the taste, but because the alternative requires faith in a version of yourself you were never taught to imagine. Resentment begins to grow here, quietly and corrosively. You resent the people who reflect your patterns back to you. You resent the world for seeming to conspire against your growth. And underneath it all, you resent yourself for not escaping sooner. Yet even this resentment becomes part of the identity, proof that life is hostile and you are cursed to navigate it alone. And when enough people wear their wounds as names, when enough stories of failure become uniforms instead of scars, the question quietly shifts from the personal to the collective. Because the shadow does not grow in isolation. It is fed by the world that learns to recognize you by your damage and rewards you for never leaving it behind. Have you ever wondered why the world applauds you most when you are quietly falling apart? You exhaust yourself and people call you driven. You stay silent through your pain and they call you strong. You remain in a broken relationship and they call you loyal. Somewhere along the way, society learned to mistake self-destruction for virtue, and you learned to perform your suffering as proof that you belong. As a child, you once learned to adapt in order to survive. As an adult, culture teaches you to overextend in order to be seen. You wake up inside a system that rewards urgency over presence, productivity over peace, endurance over honesty. Burnout is worn like a badge. Rest feels like a confession of weakness. The garden inside you dries out, but you keep smiling for the harvest no one ever asked if you wanted. Your mask becomes social currency. Your shadow becomes invisible. You scroll through endless lives that look brighter, faster, richer than your own. Social media turns other people's highlight reels into silent accusations against your becoming. Dopamine fires with every notification, every approval, every fleeting proof that you mattered for a moment. Neuroscience shows how this constant stimulation hijacks your reward system, teaching your brain to chase short bursts of validation instead of long-term meaning. You trade depth for applause without even realizing the transaction took place. Even your suffering becomes stylized. Toxic love is romanticized as passion. Obsession is mistaken for devotion. Emotional unavailability is reframed as mystery. You are taught to crave what wounds you, to desire what withholds you, to chase what keeps you uncertain. Attachment wounds quietly align with the stories culture tells about what love is supposed to look like. And soon you are no longer just repeating your own trauma. You are reenacting a script handed to millions. You try to be soft in a world that only respects armor. You try to slow down in an economy that feeds on breathless pace. You try to heal in a culture that quietly depends on your wounds to keep you buying, striving, proving, pushing. Philosophically, the question becomes unavoidable. Does the world actually benefit from your wholeness or from your endless becoming? Loneliness grows here in a peculiar way. You are surrounded by people, yet starved of resonance. You perform connection without being held by it. You exchange authenticity for safety and call the numbness maturity. Resentment simmers below the surface, not only toward the world that taught you this performance, but toward yourself for forgetting what was real before the audience arrived. And still, you keep choosing in the direction you were trained to survive in. But beneath the noise of applause and the illusion of achievement, there is a quieter reckoning waiting, because every performance has a cost, and beneath the costume of success, beneath the discipline of endurance, beneath the glamour of chaos, something fragile inside you keeps asking the same unanswered question. What happens when the mask comes off, and only the consequences remain? That question leads not to culture anymore, but to the emotional weight it leaves behind. where the true price of all this quiet self-destruction is finally paid. Have you ever noticed how the loudest pain in your life is never the one that happens during the fall, but the one that settles in after everything has gone quiet? The argument ends, the door closes, the money is gone, the relationship is over, the chaos dissolves, and what remains is not relief, but a heavy, echoing stillness where the truth finally has room to breathe. This is the part no one prepares you for, the emotional vacuum after the storm, where the damage stops moving and begins to ache. You sit alone in rooms that still remember who you were before things broke. The walls hold old laughter like dust. Your phone lights up less now. Trust feels fragile, not only toward others but toward yourself. Anxiety whispers constantly, replaying scenes your mind cannot let go of. Guilt follows behind it, not loud and accusing, but persistent, slow, and suffocating. You tell yourself to move on, but your nervous system is still pacing the wreckage, scanning for the moment you could have turned back. There is a special kind of exhaustion that comes from betraying your own potential too many times. You try to celebrate small wins, but they feel hollow, like applause in an empty theater. Emotional numbness sets in not as peace, but as protection. Neuroscience calls it shutdown, a survival response when overwhelm becomes chronic. The garden inside you isn't dead, it's dry, and every time you reach for feeling, your hands come back dusty. Think of the adult who rebuilds their life again and again, each time promising to do it differently, each time carrying the same invisible weight into new beginnings. New faces appear, new opportunities rise, but the old fatigue lingers beneath the surface, quietly asking how many more chances you will bury before you stop believing you deserve them. Attachment wounds resurface in subtler ways now. You crave closeness but brace for loss. You accept less because disappointment feels inevitable. Loneliness becomes a companion that never fully leaves, even when someone lies beside you. Resentment seeps into small moments. You resent the people who left. You resent the ones who stayed and saw too much. You resent the world for not stopping you. And deepest of all, you resent yourself for knowing what to do and still not doing it when it mattered. The mask you once wore to survive feels too heavy to lift now. The shadow you ran from sits quietly across from you, no longer chasing, no longer threatening, just waiting to be acknowledged. This is the emotional consequence of choosing the familiar flame over the unfamiliar light too many times, not punishment, not tragedy, but a slow grieving for the self that almost was. And yet, even here, something subtle begins to stir, because when the noise finally fades, when the performance ends and the room is empty, you are left with the only thing that can interrupt the cycle. Not answers, not strength, not certainty, but the fragile beginning of choice made in awareness. And that awareness, quiet as it is, becomes the narrow doorway through which change first dares to enter. Have you ever felt the moment just before a familiar mistake, that quiet fraction of a second where something inside you hesitates, as if time briefly loosens its grip and waits for your answer? This is not the voice of instinct or fear. This is the narrow space where the cycle first begins to crack. Most people rush past this moment. You are learning to stay inside it. The work does not begin with heroism. It begins with interruption, the pause before the text is sent, the breath before the argument explodes, the silence before the old habit reaches for you in the dark. Neuroscience calls this response flexibility, the ability to delay automatic reaction long enough for the rational brain to speak. At first, the pause feels unbearable. Your body is still wired to seek relief. The monster within grows restless when it is not fed immediately. But with repetition, the pause becomes wider, and inside that widening space, choice is reborn. You begin to separate urge from intention. The craving still arrives, the fear still rises, but you no longer mistake them for commands. Trauma once taught your nervous system that urgency was truth. Healing teaches it that urgency is just sensation passing through, like a shadow that looks solid in low light, but thins when you stop running from it. Self-trust rebuilds slowly. not through grand transformations, but through small promises kept when no one is watching. The garden inside you does not flood overnight. It is watered by one quiet decision at a time. You choose rest instead of self-punishment. You choose honesty instead of silence. You choose boundaries instead of overextension. Each choice feels small. Together, they begin to feel like identity. Attachment wounds start to renegotiate their contracts with you. You notice how quickly you reach for closeness, or how instinctively you withdraw from it. You learn the emotional triggers that once hijacked your will, not to eliminate them, but to meet them with awareness instead of obedience. Self-compassion replaces self-contempt, not because you suddenly feel worthy, but because you understand what made you this way. And understanding softens what force never could. There will be setbacks. The cycle does not shatter all at once. Some days you will fall back into familiar fire and hate yourself for it. But the difference now is subtle and profound. You will see it happening. You will feel the moment of choice you once missed. And even when you stumble, the story you tell yourself about the stumble will change. You will no longer speak your failures as destiny. You will speak them as information. Healing is not the absence of bad decisions. It is the growing distance between one mistake and the next. It is the slow loosening of shame's grip on your identity. It is the day you choose the unfamiliar light, not because it feels safe yet, but because staying in the dark has finally become unbearable. And as the cycle weakens, a deeper question begins to rise, beneath all practical effort. If you are no longer defined by your worst patterns, then who are you becoming without them? That question does not belong to psychology anymore. It belongs to philosophy. Have you ever noticed how quickly you reduce your whole life to a single moment of failure, as if one decision could erase every quiet act of courage that came before it? You look at the wreckage of what went wrong and say, "This is me," as though the story ended there. But identity was never built from one choice. It is built from patterns, and patterns, unlike fate, can be rewritten. You were never broken. You were conditioned. You were shaped by rooms that did not hear you, by love that felt uncertain, by safety that came with terms. Your nervous system learned to protect you in the only ways it knew how, and for a long time, those ways kept you alive. The mask you wore was not deception, it was armor. The shadow you ran from was not evil, it was memory. Even the monster within you was only trying to make sense of a world that once felt too dangerous to meet without defenses. Awareness changes the meaning of the past without erasing it. When you finally see your patterns clearly, it hurts, not because you are failing, but because you are waking up. That awakening feels like loneliness at first. You step out of the familiar flame and stand in a colder light. You feel the absence of your old identity like phantom pain. But this pain is different. It does not punish. It instructs. It tells you that you are no longer asleep inside your own life. Neuroscience says the brain is constantly rewiring, never finished, never sealed. Philosophy says the self is not a fixed object, but a river in motion. Between these two truths, something liberating emerges. You are not condemned to be who you were when survival was your only language. Each conscious decision, however small, alters the architecture of the person you are becoming. A single pause can interrupt a lifetime of momentum. A single boundary can redraw the map of your future relationships. A single act of self-respect can begin dissolving decades of self-betrayal. You will still make mistakes. You will still feel tempted by the old gravity. But the meaning of those moments will no longer be the same. You will not read them as proof of who you are. You will read them as reminders of what you are learning to outgrow. The garden inside you will not bloom all at once. Some seasons will feel barren. But even in drought, roots continue working in the dark. And one day, perhaps quietly, perhaps suddenly, you will look back at the version of yourself who once believed pain was identity, who once believed freedom was illusion, and you will feel something unexpected. Not shame, not regret, but compassion. Because you will finally understand that every wrong turn you took was made by someone who was still trying to find a way through. You are not your worst choice. You are the one who is now awake enough to choose again.